Hello, I'm Deryck. I'm the Chief Executive of Play to the Crowd, the charity that runs Theatre Royal Winchester, as well as Hat Fair and Playmakers, of course. We're taking this moment to think a little bit about Theatre Royal Winchester as a heritage building in Winchester, because once again we're trying to save it as a building for our local community as a result of the COVID pandemic. And I'm here today with Phil Yates, who is actually one of the saviours of this building from way back in the 70s. Hello, Phil.
Hello, Deryck.
So listen, let's talk first about the nature of this building, because it was never built as a theatre in the first place, was it?
No, it was built in 1850 as the Market Hotel. The whole part you see white from there to Joy Street was built as the Market Hotel. Why Market Hotel? Well, this area where we're standing now, this Discovery Centre, that was the cattle market, and farmers would come from miles around with their cattle to the market and the Corn Exchange, which today is the public library.
Yes.
And that was built in 1838, but there was nowhere for farmers to stay overnight. And so it was decided to have a small hotel very close to the cattle market. And this was the result. And this opened in 1850 as the Market Hotel.
And as I understand, there was a saddlers behind and all sorts of other infrastructure supporting the people who were coming to trade.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
There was all that going on. And of course, the area where you see today the fly tower and the extension, that would have been the car, not the car park, the park where they used to park their horse-drawn carriages when they would come to the cattle market.
Yes, no, that's really interesting, and we'll talk more about that extension and when the building became a theatre in a moment or two.
Yes.
Shall we go inside, Phil?
Let's do that,
All right.
Deryck. Okay,
Come
off
with
we
me.
go.
So you can see we've recently rebranded the theatre. Once again, a different sort of way of expressing who we are, writ large in a contemporary way on the building now. But as you know very well, Phil, each generation you have to reimagine the theatre for a contemporary audience, don't you?
You certainly do, and you've done a marvellous job making that so that people can see where we are.
Indeed. Let's come on in here.
Yes, let's do that.
Mind a step. So we're now in what is our refurbished cafe bar, which we only refurbished in the autumn. But years and years ago, this was the theatre pub, wasn't it? Just here?
Yes, just where we're standing was the theatre pub. It was called the theatre pub because when it was the hotel, the bar would have been here for the hotel patrons and for the farmers. But when it was converted into a theatre, this was the theatre pub, or theatre bar as they're called later, and that remained until all these alterations came about later on.
Yeah, let's move on down through the foyer now.
Well, this area would have been the entrance for patrons to the Market Hotel. Two doors which would have been there.
And I've seen pictures as well that the building used to have wrought iron balconies all the way around the front of the buildings, didn't
That's right, yes.
Yeah.
So that
presumably for hotel guests to take the air.
Yes, presumably that would have been so.
Yeah. Let's move on down to what is now our cafe bar area. But Phil, as we move through this arch, we're actually moving out of the hotel into different properties altogether, aren't we?
Yes, we're now moving into the two shops that would have been on this site. And I remember this site here where we're standing was Peckham's Florists and Fruiterers. And next door would have been a restaurant, Sharp's restaurant.
And didn't you have a relationship with Peckham's?
Yes.
Was that your aunt?
Yes, Mrs. Peckham was my aunt.
Wow, that's extraordinary. So you have a real personal interest in this building, don't you?
I certainly do. I remember coming in as a boy and she would allow me to go into the store at the back to pick out any apples or bananas I wanted to take home.
That's amazing. So these two shops were amalgamated in order to give more circulation space for the theatre back in the late 70s, early 80s?
Yes, the theatre, we purchased the theatre in 1977. And again, it was my idea. These two shops were up for sale. And I just happened to say one day, would it be a good idea if we purchased them? Well, we had to pay more for the two shops than we did for the theatre 2 years before. We paid £35,000 for the theatre, but £68,000 for these two shops. Where did the money come from? Well, we had to go to the bank and get a couple of mortgages out.
Well,
but it was a good thing we did because it enhances the theatre.
I'll tell you what, Phil, let's go and take a seat a little just through here, and we can talk some more about that whole extraordinary period. Because we nearly lost the building altogether, didn't we?
Yes, we certainly did.
So where are we now, Phil?
Well, we would be now in the garden of the two shops.
Yeah.
And when I worked here, I remember we had a kitchen over there, and you could look onto the gardens, and there was ivy going all up the wall. You couldn't see the wall at all. It was covered with ivy. So we used the two shops. One we let out to a person who sold second-hand clothes, but Sharp's part was the box office, and the administration staff used the rooms above, which would have been the living accommodation of those who owned the shops.
And in the early days, in the 70s, Hat Fair, who is now part of our charity, of course, had office space in this building, didn't they?
Exactly, because as you know, I worked here as a marketing assistant for a while, and Jonathan Kay, who started Hat Fair in 1974, he used to walk through the office to go to his little office at the side. But I can tell you this, because we didn't have the money to redecorate the offices, the actual wallpaper was falling off the wall, and the ceiling was halfway down. We worked under dangerous circumstances. We didn't know whether the ceiling was going to collapse or not while we were doing our marketing.
Wow. And you know, the outside wall behind us is proof that this was outside space originally.
Yes.
It's obviously now part of our cafe.
Yes,
bar.
you can envisage that all this space here, from that wall over to there, was the garden. And there was a gate at the back so they could go into the car park at the back. And again, it was a very small car park. Don't forget, we had an extension for the theatre, which took up most of the car park, but it was very small.
Yeah. I want to...
And also, may I add, there were 3 cottages where the car park is now. There were 3 cottages, and they belonged to the Simpkin brothers. And in one was the projectionist who lived there, Bill Gilmore. I knew him and his son. His son was born here. He was the commissionaire, dressed in a beautiful green uniform with a peak cap and gloves above the shoulders. And the third one was, I think, another member of staff. So Simpkins not only owned the theatre, or as a cinema, they owned the cottages too.
And we'll come back to the Simpkins brothers, because there's some good stories about them in a moment. I want to just introduce your lovely book, which you and Madeline Smith brought together, oh gosh, 10 or more years ago now, I think. But as the current kind of curator, if you like, or protector of this building, I've taken some time to read this, and there's just, right at the beginning, there's a quote by John Ruskin that feels very appropriate to our moment now, sort of in the midst of the COVID pandemic, and having once again to try to find a way to save the building, in effect. Ruskin once said, "Watch an old building with anxious care. Guard it as best you may, and at any cost, from any influence of dilapidation. Count its stones and bind it together when it loosens or declines. Do this tenderly, reverently, and continually, and many a generation may yet be born and pass away beneath its shadow." And somehow, I mean, that makes me quite emotional just reading it, because back in the 70s, Phil, you were one of a small band of people who were instrumental in saving the building that was then our theatre from demolition.
Yes.
Tell us about that risk and what happened. in the
Well,
70s.
the position was that all of a sudden Star Group cinemas, they didn't want this building. What happened in 1971, the Rank organisation sold the Odeon down the road where Richard Moss House is, and one or two other Odeon cinemas throughout the country, and just for good measure they just pushed this in as part of the deal. But Star Group didn't really want this building. They wanted to concentrate on the Odeon to convert it into 3 screens and bingo. So they ran this building down deliberately because they wanted to concentrate on their other building. So all of a sudden they announced that the cinema was going to close on the 28th of June 1974, and that is what happened. And soon after that, we heard that we were thinking of applying for a demolition order to demolish the cinema, to sell it for commercial purposes. And there was a story that Iceland, which was then Bijan, was interested in acquiring this site for a supermarket. Well, we couldn't allow that to happen, and Stanley Still, who was the mayor of Winchester at the time, and of course the Still family have been involved all the way through with his son, and of course now his grandson. And Stanley rang me one night and said, the cinema on Joy Street is closing, and we've got to do something about it if we want a theatre for Winchester, which you keep writing letters in the Hampshire Chronicle about. Will you join me and a few others to try and form an action group? We met, and within an hour the action group was formed.
So Phil, the action group was formed, the plan was in place, and as I understand it, you managed to persuade the City Council to list the building to protect it from demolition, is that right?
Yes, again, through Stanley Still and one or two other influential councillors, shall I say, they persuaded the City Council to apply for a listed building status, which they did, and a Grade 2, it was under a Grade 2 listing, which meant that Star Group couldn't carry on what they wanted to do to demolish the building. They had to sell the building as it was, and that's where negotiations came into force, not only with us, but there were other bidders. One bidder wanted it as a chapel, like the Ritz Cinema down the road is now the Hope Church. They wanted to have a chapel here. Well, it took us 2 years, because they started off by asking, I think it was £150,000. This is 1974 to 77, mind you, a lot of money. Well, of course, we couldn't afford even £20, never mind that. And it took us 2 years to bargain between other bidders and the Star Group's agents, which were in London, to come to some agreement. And in the end, we said that we would pay £30,000. And they said, no, it's got to be £35,000 or nothing, and you've got to make up your mind straight away. So what could we do? We said, okay, £35,000 it is. And then we had to raise the money of the 35, well, I think we had to go to the bank because the Star Group wanted the money quickly. But then we had to start an appeal to raise the money.
Yeah, so it's funny, isn't it, how things come around again, because here we are now, once again, in survival appeal mode as a result of the COVID pandemic. Listen, Phil, what I'd love to do now is actually go on stage and have a look at what you saved, because I think, once people sort of realise what could have been lost, they're very motivated to want to save it as a community. And we're finding now, once again, the community is coming to our aid because they care about a building that is, frankly, simply gorgeous. So Phil, here we are on the stage, but of course, before it was a theatre, this wasn't the stage, of course, at all. It was the back of the hotel?
Yes, the rear wall of the hotel would have come down where the circle begins now. So all this part of the stalls in the auditorium, including the stage here, would have been the parking space for horse-drawn carriages to bring their customers to the hotel, and they would park their carriages here. And then when the motor cars came into force around about 1900, they did have an advert about the Market Hotel with loose boxes at the rear for horse-drawn carriages, and also space for your motor vehicle.
Oh, motor vehicles, yes, of course. We take those for granted now, don't we, unfortunately? Yes. I'm really interested to know how this building moved from being a hotel to being a theatre, because obviously as a modern theatre manager, we have no end of problems, of course, with the fact that it wasn't originally designed as a theatre. So many of the backstage spaces were sort of constructed from various bits of hotel. But it was the Simpkins brothers, wasn't it? And,
yes.
And as I understand, they first started a theatre down at St John's House.
Yes, well, John and James Simpkins were like the impresarios, I suppose you would say, of Winchester, because they didn't only run the Palace Variety Theatre at St John's House, but during the Great War, they had, up at Morn Hill, was an army camp, and they had a temporary hall. It was like a corrugated iron building as an entertainment centre for the troops. And they also had an ice rink somewhere or other. They were really into entertainment, full stop. So when the war finished, that temporary building was brought down to Park Avenue, and they converted that into a cinema.
Right.
But coming back to here, they purchased the hotel in 1912. What happened was they had the Palace Variety Theatre, which is St John's House, from 1910 to 1914, but they wanted a building of their own design, because down there it was the banqueting hall. It wasn't built as a theatre at all. So the chance came in 1910 or no, 1911, 1912, I think, that the hotel was put up for sale, because the cattle market was still there, the Corn Exchange, but they didn't really need the hotel anymore, so it was put up for sale, and the Simpkin brothers purchased it and employed Mr. Chancellor was his name, a well-known local architect. He's never designed a theatre in his life, and asked him if he would design a theatre out of the hotel. So he designed the building, as you see today, by carving into the hotel and building the auditorium and the stage out into the yard of the hotel. And so in 1912, the plans were approved overnight.
Yeah.
Not like today, you've got to wait 3 or 4 months. It was done overnight. And then they, of course, the Simpkin brothers, there were other brothers, and they were not only entrepreneurs of the theatre, but the other brothers went to the building line. So they, I think, managed to have a family to build the theatre out of the hotel themselves.
And as I understand, Phil, the cream and gold decorations on the circle are the original, or that was the similar design to what we now have.
Yes, that is original with the cherubs.
Yeah.
We'll come to that later, I expect, but that is the original, and so that in 1914 the theatre opened as the Royal Theatre, August 24th, 1914, which was a little, not a very good time to open a theatre, because that was 3 weeks after the outbreak of the First World War.
Indeed.
So it wasn't a very good time. But the Cine Variety, they wanted to continue, as they did at the Palace, with variety acts, and in between the variety acts were short cine films with Charlie Chaplin or one of the silent stars. And of course the newsreel was very important to keep the people up to date of the battles that were going on in France.
We now like to think that this is one of the best surviving examples of a cine variety theatre of that time.
As I understand it, this is the last one of the original cine variety theatres in the country. This is the very last one in its original state.
Yeah, and it used to be known as a daisy date theatre.
Yes, daisy date theatre was a term used for choruses, daisy date dancers. They were young dancers dancing on the stage with musical acts. And one of the dancers on the stage was a young lady by the name of Grace Stansfield. You won't know her by Grace Stansfield, but you will know her as Dame Gracie Fields. She was just a chorus girl here in 1915, but by 1920 she had changed her name to Gracie Fields. At least Archie Pitts, who she married, changed the name. He thought Stansfield wasn't quite right, so he cut off the Stans and called her Gracie Fields. And they came back here in 1920 with their review called Mr. Tower of London, with Gracie Fields as the star. Yeah. And of course, after that, Gracie Fields became very well known not only in British films, but she went to Hollywood, made Hollywood films, and she did a lot of charity work during the war and after the war, and she was made a Dame of the British Empire. Yeah. So when we came to open the theatre in 1978, we immediately thought of Dame Gracie Fields, and we asked her, of course she was living in Capri then, a famous island, a famous house on the island of Capri, and we asked if she would like to come over, or is she able to come over to open it. Well, she wasn't in good health. Unfortunately, she died the next year. But she did send us a telegram on opening night to say how much she remembered the Theatre Royal Winchester, and she did keep in touch with one of the managers, lady managers that was here. They had this correspondence which went right through the years, so she had that contact with the Theatre Royal Winchester for many, many years, and she just wished us well on opening night.
Wonderful. And in those early cine variety days, the live acts between the newsreels and the silent movies were known as lantern coolers.
Yes, well, obviously they were put on, all these acts were on stage to cool the lanterns down, because the early cine variety films were shown through early projectors or slides, lantern slides. So obviously these acts came on in between these slides to cool the lanterns down. That's why they were called lantern coolers.
Before we move off the stage, every theatre has its ghost stories. And we'll talk about the most famous one when we go up into the circle. But I understand from reading your book that there was a dancing girl that used to cross the stage.
Yes. There again, we're going back to the chorus girls, the daisy dates.
Yes.
And one of them kept company with one of the early stage crew that were here in the early days. But of course, during the Great War, he was called up, and the story goes that she was dancing on the stage, and all of a sudden she fainted. And Jimmy Simpkins comes on the stage and says, "What's the trouble?" And she said, "I just seen my fiancé in the prompt corner, which is over there." And he said, "Well, you couldn't have done. He's on active service, serving his country in France." Well, it turned out that the time that she saw the apparition over there, that was the time he was killed on the fields of France.
Wow. And I've also read in your book, Phil, that you yourself have experienced a cold draft as you go to the prompt corner.
Yes, well, I used to work here in temporary part-time as marketing assistant, and one of my jobs was to come in the mornings to turn the lights on in the theatre. Not today, of course, you're turned on automatic, but I had to come down the stairs onto the stage to switch the lights on from the switchboard. And one day I came down. Of course, we had fire buckets in those days full of sand in case there was a fire in the auditorium.
We still do.
Yes. And one day I came in, and I don't know why, I felt this sort of draft going over me, and I stopped. And a good thing I did stop, because somebody had accidentally put these buckets in the middle of the gangway. And if I went on, I would have fallen over them and probably broken a leg or something. But I got to the switchboard and switched on and saw these buckets. Well, I think it was John Simpkins that was warning me not to go further. His apparition was telling me that.
So here we are now in the circle of the auditorium, and we've been talking about ghosts, Phil, but the most famous ghost story is connected back to those brothers that converted the hotel into a theatre in the first place. Tell us about that.
Yes, well, over the proscenium arch is the crest, or cartouche, which is the true theatrical term, in the middle there, and on that crest used to be the initials JS, which could stand for John Simpkins or James Simpkins. And one day, John said to James, I think we ought to be called J and JS to include both our names. And James promised John that would be done, but John died before James, and it is said that his ghost haunts the theatre to see if the initials were ever changed. And he comes out of the wall, which is over there, and walks along the back row, which we call the ghost walk, and comes down and into one of those boxes and looks at the cartouche and then disappears through the wall. Now you may think I'm telling a fast one here, but one of our stage crews some years ago, she was a bit psychic, but she said to me one day, oh, by the way, I've seen a gentleman dressed in a dark cloak looking at that cartouche, and then he disappeared. I said, oh, that would be John Simpkins come back to see if it's ever changed.
What a wonderful story. And obviously, when you were involved in saving the theatre in the 70s and then actually in the 80s and the 90s, there were so many changes that had to happen to the building to bring it up to date and to make it fit for a theatre for the sort of 20th century and so on. Can you tell us a little bit about what we're looking at now and what it was like when it was being refurbished? Because it was filthy, wasn't it?
This is the big one.
Yeah.
I mean, it's been refurbished so many times, but the big one was between 1996 and 2001, where the new foyer, as you have seen, and all that area was refurbished and knocked down and more or less rebuilt. And the same applied to inside here. The whole stage had to be gutted, all the seats taken out, and I remember an excavator was stuck in the middle of the stalls down there. And of course, with any building in Winchester, you've got to have an archaeological dig. And the archaeological men came along and dug into the stage area, and they found bones and other implements which go back into about the 12th or 13th century. And we found out that this would have been a dumping ground like you have down now, Bar End. This would have been a dumping ground for people who lived in this area to dump all their waste goods. And of course, it was also the time of the when the Jewish community were here. They used Joy Street as their place for worship and for selling their goods. So that goes back all those years.
And what were some of the developments in that refurbishment that were introduced to the theatre? Because there were some quite major improvements made at that time.
Yes, well, not only the stage, of course, before 1996, I think it was 1985, we had a new circle bar installed, and the stage was extended back into the car park, and the fly tower, if you look at the fly tower, you can see the original height of the fly tower, and then it went up, I think, another several feet further up as you see it today. So all of that had to be done between 1996 and 2001, the extension of the stage and the extension of the fly tower.
Yeah. And you were involved not only in the 70s but also at that time as well.
Yeah, yes, well, it's not only me. I should mention people like Richard Still, and after Stanley Still died, Richard Still took over, and now his son, Ian Still. But there's so many of us, they seem to single me out, but I was just one of a group. We called ourselves originally the Gang of Six. Of course, the six of us started it all off. But then others came along and worked very hard over the years. So it was a team effort.
And you also acted as for many years, and in fact you still do, as the archivist. You've sort of officially retired that role in your 90s now, Phil, but actually you still come in and tell us things that we've not come across before,
yes,
don't you?
Of course, I was born not too far from this theatre in Newburgh Street, which is only a few blocks from here. So as a child, my parents would bring me here to see the films of Lauren Hardy and George Formby and of course Gracie Fields. So I've always had that interest in the theatre as a cinema. And of course, when Stanley rang and asked if I would like to help form a group to save the theatre, I immediately said yes, of course. And the rest is history.
And I mean, there's been a long history of theatre in Winchester. I mean, you could go all the way back to the church in pre-medieval times, but actually in terms of theatre buildings, as I understand it, the first theatre that took place, professional theatre in a building, was the Market House Theatre.
Yes, where the City Museum is today,
in the square,
there was that area in those days was again a place where they sold cattle and goods and so on. So you had the Market House, and where the museum is, that part of it would have been the Market House, and then above, it was only a very small theatre. Above, in the upper part of the museum or Market House, would have been the Market House Theatre, and that started at about 1620. And funnily enough, one of the producers that brought his company down from London was a Mr. Yates.
Any relation? No relation.
I've been trying to find that out. But at any rate, it was. I just imagine having a theatre above where they're selling cattle underneath. Right underneath you, and you're trying to see a play in this small theatre.
Because it was a meat market, wasn't it?
It was a meat market, you see, so you had the cattle underneath and the theatre above. But then that lasted until, I think it was like 1750. The first purpose-built theatre was here in Joy Street.
But not here.
No, here. When I said here, I meant in Joy Street.
Yes.
And what is now Sheridan House, where Copyman offices and shop is now, that was built on the site of the original theatre, which was called Winchester Theatre to start with, but then it was changed to Theatre Royal. Hence, further along in years, the Simkin brothers decided to call this Theatre Royal. So that was the original first purpose-built theatre in Winchester. I think it was 1785 or some date like that.
And actually still the only purpose-built theatre, because as we've discussed already, this was originally a hotel here.
Yes, right. and it was called Sheridan House, by the way, today, because the first production in the theatre on that site was Sheridan's The Rivals, hence Sheridan House.
Yeah. I want to finish, Phil, by reading another little section from your book right at the end, because again, as somebody who has only been kind of the protector for the theatre for 3.5 years, unlike you, because you're now in your 90s, I won't embarrass you with your actual age, but you've been the protector for the theatre since the 70s. So I feel sort of humbled in a way to be trying to follow in your footsteps. And there's this wonderful section right at the end of the book that tells us about the history of the theatre. And I do want to read this because it just feels really powerful to me. Over the past 10 decades, Theatre Royal Winchester has experienced many highs and lows. For many of us involved, there have been headaches and sleepless nights as well. And this is your words, Phil, isn't it? The building itself has gone through a number of changes of use, refurbishments and extensions, from cine variety to cinema to a real live theatre. Over the last 30 years, the auditorium has been utilised not only for theatrical performances, but also conferences, seminars, television and radio broadcasts, weddings and even wrestling, you write. Since 1974, the theatre has narrowly avoided demolition, survived a series of rebuilding and rebuilding projects, and battled through funding crises and assorted disasters. But the Theatre Royal Winchester is a survivor. And that, for me, feels like a really sort of pertinent thing to say at this moment, because once again, we are in survival mode. And we have a survival appeal running at the moment in August 2020, which is actually in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. So once again, Phil, we are having to rely on our community to gather together to save this extraordinary building. And just to finish, you go on to say, for all its renovations, the venue retains a certain charm and intimacy, an important factor for those of us who harbour an abiding affection for the original building. Long may it continue to bring live theatre to the community of Winchester and district well into the 21st century and beyond. We should take pride in the fact that Theatre Royal Winchester has been described by historians and the public alike as one of the loveliest little theatres in England. And long may that continue, Phil. I want to thank you personally for your guardianship of this theatre, and I want to try to hold that baton brightly for the future on your behalf and make sure that Theatre Royal Winchester can survive into the future. So if you care about the theatre, please do contribute to our survival appeal on crowdfunder.co.uk/play to the crowd. Thank you. Thank you, Phil.
Thank you, Deryck, for all your work with the theatre and your marvellous team. They are really the best team we've ever had.